Good evening. We're here at the Norval Foundation, and this is one of the first walkabouts that is being done on Instagram. We each week will take you through the exhibitions that have opened here at Norval. I think we're one of the first museums to reopen, and with 4 new exhibitions. It's not just reopening. And this evening we are going to be looking at the exhibition Jackson Hlungwani, Omega, an exhibition that has been curated by Nessa Leibhammer, Amos Latour and myself. And Nessa is here with us this evening. And we will be taking you through the exhibition. Nessa will initially talk about Jackson Hlungwani's life, and I will then start to lead you through the gallery spaces. Nessa.
Good evening. Jackson Hlungwani was born in around 1923. We're not 100% sure of his exact date. And he was born into a Tsonga-speaking family who are very proud of their Shangaan lineage. There's a particular history, so militaristic history associated with the Shangaan group. He grew up in a rural area, herding his family's livestock with his brothers. He did not attend school. He was taught by his father, who was a carver and metal worker, as is mentorship in Africa. Generally, these are handed down through the families. These skills are handed down. He went in 1940. He went to Johannesburg as a migrant worker. He worked there only for 4 years and was retrenched because of an industrial accident in which he lost a finger. And he went back home to his Mbokoto, where he lived really for the rest of his life. And he started carving. He had been carving probably as a young man, utility objects, but he was ordained into the Zionist church. He became an ordained lay preacher, and he was disillusioned with the Zionist church, and he was looking for a true religion. He had a particular epiphany, which we will talk about later, and it's from that time that his sculpture really began to flourish. He began to create really extraordinary works linked to both his Tsonga heritage and his Christian beliefs, which were influenced by an Africanist notion of Christianity.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So this evening we're going to take you through the different galleries. The initial gallery looks at the historic material out of which Hlungwani's work emerged. We look at the second gallery, which has a group of early crucifixes which are extremely moving, and then into a gallery dealing with his symbolic work that are related to both the metaphors of hands and feet, the gallery with the angels and plants, and then into the final gallery space, which deals with the site of Mbokoto and where the altars were placed, which is the focus of this exhibition. So we're going to walk from here into the first gallery space, and as we walk, one understands that most artists are influenced by the culture out of which they grow, and it is with these cultures that we as artists embrace the values, embrace many of the conventions, but we also work with and against them. And I'm standing here next to a beautiful staff which is from the Limpopo region. You will see it is a hand holding an egg on top of a staff, this very singular form. It has beautifully carved fingernails, and it relates to a particular saying in the region which says that people should treat each other with care, much like holding an egg, that one should be able to hold the egg firmly enough so that it doesn't fall, or not tightly enough to crush it. So it's a wonderful way of thinking about each other in this metaphorical mode. If we go to the staff next to it, you will see a very early, most probably a 19th century piece that came from London, and it has a face in the front with two hands, and in those hands are eggs. Above that is a little heifer, and as we come around to this side, you will see a small smiling fish, and as we come further, you will see the undersole of a shoe, which is empty. It would have been a cavity filled with snuff and a little sole placed into it. And as we come around again further, back to the face, you'll see that the mouth is open. So the snuff could be sniffed out of the mouth itself, and the snuff is associated with the ancestral world. So in the staff we have the image of the hand, we have the image of the egg, we have the image of the heifer with a strange little hat, something like what Jackson Hlungwani wore, and then the fish. So there's a composite iconography here, and of course the foot related to the shoe. There's also an organic quality to the interrelationship between each of these symbols. It's not symmetrical or geometric, but has this fluidity. From here, we're going to look at a series of, well, a particular headrest, I think, which is a very early Tsonga Shangan headrest, which has a base which is a foot. And you will see that the upright is flexed almost as though it's a knee, and then the sleeping platform on top is where the head of its owner, the recipient, would sleep. And these were both practical and ritual objects which linked their owners to the ancestral world in the sleep state. And we feel the sort of angled quality which creates a sense of visual instability within the piece. And this would have been made by a carver up in the northern Limpopo region historically, and that is the area where many of the great carvers emerged. As we scan across, you will see a headrest by Hlungwani himself, carved many years after these headrests were out of use. And Hlungwani carves his headrest with a book on the sleeping surface, so it's not practically usable. The headrests were used at this time by Nyangas, Sangomas, and healers, and they were sometimes buried with recipients. But in this particular piece, the book on the sleeping platform would be the Bible, and that this headrest would link Hlungwani to his ancestors, but also to the biblical figures who become really part of his life. As we scan across, we see another headrest carved by Hlungwani, and in it there is the sense of asymmetry again. There's a kind of wildness that you can see the antecedents of the previous headrests with these curved surfaces, but it starts to fracture and become much, much more organic, which is something that we associate with Hlungwani's work. So we now are going to move across to Nessa Leibhammer, who's going to talk about the stellar panel, one of Hlungwani's pieces that were carved at the time that he was involved in a project of printing. Nessa.
Thank you. I'm standing next to stellar panel, which is here to my left. I think what strikes you is the circular nature of the panel and the exploding quality of these stars that just burst out in all directions. This has been described by the Reverend Theo Schneider, who is a great friend of Jackson's, as Hlungwani's nightly work and his spiritual energy spreading around. And what is very fascinating is that these are stars, but they also resemble the crosses from Ethiopia and Eritrea. They are not so much the Western Christian cross, which with its unequal crosses. They are more round. They have a particular format. You see them, exploding all around, and the detail in here is quite extraordinary. And you have a little train there and a bus. Motifs that occur repeatedly. You find it in other of his works, and may reference travel from this world to another world, travel across worlds. We're not 100% sure what it might mean. To my right, we have the first one that I will discuss is Wisdom Circle. In a way, this is a mapping of Hlungwani's cosmology onto the world. It is his vision of a harmonious world where wild and domesticated animals live together in peace. You have wild and domesticated plants. You have a section at the top where you have little snakes and birds that are the messengers to the spirit world. These messages in Africa they are messengers to the ancestors, and they are also messengers to the spirit world, to God and heaven. Below you have the representation of a journey across water, which is really significant, as you will in the next room. Karel will describe the journeys from the Middle East with the drum, and you have the stars. Again, a very significant motif is the guiding stars that guide people on their journeys, on their religious and sacred journeys with particular items.
Would you like to talk about
yes.
Cain and Abel?
So in this panel, again, very significant representation of Hlungwani's world. Just briefly, you have two figures. The one at the top is number 2, and the one at the bottom is number 1. Number 2 is Abel, is identified as Abel. In fact, the little sticking out headdress you'll see later on the figure on the altar. He is, in Hlungwani's mind, he is the progenitor of European Christianity. The figure below, which is Cain, which is number 1, again in Hlungwani's reading, he's the progenitor of African Christianity, and for Hlungwani that was the true Christianity, because it has a great antiquity, in fact, before European Christianity was established.
Good, thank you, Nessa. So as we talk about Christianity, we move into the next gallery space, which is a particularly important room in that it shows Hlungwani's crucifixes, which are works which have never been shown together before. And as we enter this room, we see the crucifixes close by, and in the distance you will see the hand of God. And so the exhibition unfolds in layers, and one is able to get glimpses of different periods of work from one room to another. In this room with the crucifixes, we are able to, for the first time, place the first crucifix in the same space as the second crucifix, and the third here, and the final crucifix. I think maybe what we can do is just look at them in more closely. You will see how these crucifixes have very early antecedents. The piece behind me from Johannesburg Art Gallery looks almost like a 10th century sculpture from Germany or Europe, and it at the top has the bird, which is often associated with the Holy Spirit. In the lower region it has snakes, which in the Bible we associate, of course, with Adam and Eve and the garden, but they also are associated with the ancestral realm within African cosmology. And the figure has braids attached to it, which are associated with initiations that have occurred very often in Zionist groups in South Africa. And there is a very beautiful early photograph taken by Ricky Burnett of this sculpture nailed to a tree at Mbokoto up in Limpopo province, which shows it within the natural world rather than within a church setting. The second crucifix, which is from the Omer Stone Museum, has also this strong weathered quality, and we see the development of an iconography here which starts to become both Western but African. Above Christ's head is a drum, and this drum is associated with early African Christianity, with the Ark of the Covenant coming down to Ethiopia, and then a mythical story of a drum being carried all the way down from the Middle East into the Limpopo region. And Nessa Leibhammer will talk about this later. But the Christ here has these irregular shaped cross beams on the Christ, which allow it to seemingly fly. It feels more like an Icarus than a traditional crucifix. And we see in the lower part of the sculpture a very beautiful bird, which is again like the Western Holy Spirit, but it also relates to the rain bird, or possibly to the chapunga, which is the lightning bird, which is linked to the ancestral world. In its mouth is another crucifix, and that becomes the genesis for the third crucifix. As we move across, you will see how the same bird is here at the base of this very powerful and very austere crucifix. We see how the hands of the Christ are nailed to this crossbeam, and there is a kind of visual pain that we see in the stylized nature of the sculpture, but of the hands, they remind me a bit of the stylization of Guernica, and the way Picasso had worked towards an imagining or an empathetic quality in image making. But in all the three of these sculptures there is a sense of pathos and power, and here we see how what is normally in Western crucifixes a loincloth, here we have a small front apron, which is much more like a beaded apron, or sometimes the Tonga people have a small mirror. So we see these shifts happening within the piece. When we look across at the fourth crucifix, this is where we see the radical shifts for Hlungwani, where he now places, it's a self-portrait of himself on the cross, and we have a small headrest-like image here, and on the vertical crossbeam are a series of ankles with the sort of back of the foot, so you get a pair of feet, a pair of feet, a pair of feet, and this is an image that starts to emerge in Hlungwani's work. We say, you know, we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us, and so the eye moves up to the image of Christ, and here his hands are no longer pinned horizontally to the cross but are raised, and there is a sense of liberation that seems to appear in this image at this point, and it's as though Hlungwani is starting to be much more inventive in the way he renders biblical imagery. On the right-hand side are three stars, and on the left-hand side it's a single star with a blade over here, and that single star with a blade is the first inkling of the Archangel Michael and we'll see a very beautiful sculpture of Archangel Michael with this blade later. The crossbeams become feathered-like, so there's also this allusion to flying. And so this is the last of the crucifixes, and as we leave this room, this is the last of the traditional Western biblical imagery that we will see. Hlungwani develops his own language, and so in the exhibition the objects are used for didactic purposes in his community, and there are stories around each of the pieces. So we come into the third room, where we are looking at a number of metonymic pieces, where pieces stand, or images stand, a detail will represent the whole. And maybe Nessa, you can talk to us about God's leg with eggs. Thank you, Nessa.
Right. This sculpture here, as Karel has indicated, is God's leg with eggs. At first it seems an extraordinarily strange sculpture form to make, but if we begin to unpack its symbolism in reference to Jackson and his life and his belief, it really does make sense. So we mentioned that he had a moment which was an epiphany. So Jackson had suffered for many years from painful abscesses on his right leg that did not heal. And he had got to such a point in his life of desperation that he decided to commit suicide. On the brink of this act of suicide, he had an epiphany. And Christ appeared to him with two companions. In this epiphany, Christ gave him three promises: that he would be healed, that he would see God, and he would serve God for the rest of his life. And in this moment, which is in the late 70s, really when he's already in his 50s, is really the beginning of his career as a priest. As he starts his own church and he begins to carve very proactively. So you ask, well, what is happening here? So it's the right leg. And Jackson's right leg was the leg that was afflicted with sores. So in one way, the eggs are the painful swelling abscesses that affected him. On another level of reading, they are eggs. Eggs are the symbol of rebirth, of regeneration. So in what is encapsulated in this work is both his suffering and his salvation. So it's formed, and so the reading of this is complex and yet makes a great deal of sense in terms of Hlungwani's life. Thank you.
So what is fascinating is that after Hlungwani sees Christ and the two helpers, he does, in fact, when they leave him, he does see God, and that he sees these huge legs of God walking over the hills towards KwaZulu-Natal. So God is so big that all that can be seen are these big feet. So this is where the part really stands for the whole. And this is the first appearance really of God in his work. And he really becomes one of the characters. One of the living presences. And we move across here to the hand of God. So a bit like the leg, which has this autobiographical quality, the hand of God in most biblical thought is seen in relation to the reach of God or of divinity. We say we leave it in the hand of God or in the hands of God. And that the hand of God was involved in particular incidents. And when we see the sculpture, it has an enormous fluidity to it. We previously have seen the hand holding the egg on a stick as an isolated element. We saw that foot on the headrest. So in this room, we see how those early antecedents are used in Hlungwani's work, and how they lead to new sculptural forms. It looks, on the piece you'll see the fingernails that we saw so beautifully carved on the sticks, and we also see a fluidity in the piece. It's as though the hand is seen through water, and it is the growth pattern of the wood itself, which Hlungwani embraces, so that it has a potency in his relationship between the natural world and, in many ways, his own will on the material. The potters, the great Japanese ceramicists always say that the potter shapes the clay and the clay shapes the potter. So it's this dialogue between the two that we see so powerfully in Hlungwani's work. And when we move from this room into the next room, you will see that the imagery has now shifted far from Western images of saints or angels towards metaphorical images that talk to the angelic world. And maybe, Nessa, you can talk to us about Michael Starr.
Thank you. Thank you. So the work that stands to my right is called Michael Starr, and it is a representation of the Archangel Michael. If you look at this, it doesn't, it is an extremely abstract form that doesn't really have any human associations, and so it is an articulation of a concept of Michael Starr, the warrior, the protector, and the leader. The Archangel Michael was the star that led the Ethiopians from Jerusalem to Ethiopia, and again the Venda and Lemba from Ethiopia, from Northeast Africa down to the mythologies tell of how Michael Starr, as a column of smoke or fire or a star at night, protected and guided them. So what we see here is the warrior Michael Starr. He has a 4-blade-like shafts that project out in all directions, kind of where the top of his head might be, and one that projects right up at the top. And the 5-pointed star is associated with the Solomonic dynasty, which is a very important one to the ancient Ethiopian church. Along the side there are birds, as on the crucifixes there are symbols, sort of quite abstract symbols of birds. And so Hlungwani has encapsulated two aspects of this warrior entity. It is both bellicose, it is strong and ready to fight, but it also guides with its shining beams of light, and will shine out to guide the way. Beautiful. Right. Thank you.
I think what's also so important with Michael Starr is that this is the Archangel Michael, but he doesn't conform to any Western notion of an angel. There are no big wings with feathers or draperies or a sense of lightness. I mean, he's a very austere image. The Archangel Michael also guides towards the future, and that as a warrior he is fearsome. I can't find in my own mindset a place for the sculpture in the history of sculpture. It seems to come from left field, and it looks more like a ninja object than anything else. It's got this fearsome, almost weapon-like quality, and of course the angels are seen as potent beings. So we get this enormous abstraction with Michael, and with the Archangel Gabriel we come across another kind of angel. He doesn't float or hover. He stands his full weight on the ground. He looks as though he's about to pounce. He has a spear in his hand, beautifully carved hand, that he raises up. And when one looks at his head, you will see that there is a light which looks a bit like a miner's light, and on the when you come to the side of it, it is actually a small pouch which could well be the bag in which the hakata or the throwing bones are placed. So Gabriel looks into the past and is a historical figure, and Hlungwani here depicts him as semi-military and very much part of the world. So he is like he's like a security guard, and on his back he has a small knapsack. He has scabbards, and he has very precise insignia on his arm, which deals with stars and and the crosses, the Christian crosses, as well as military symbols on him. And when we look at him, the side here, one's not quite sure whether those are ribs or whether that is a wing that is wrapped around him. When we look at these two angels, which are part of a very abstract world, the antithesis happens when we look at the plant formations which Hlungwani carves. And maybe, Nessa, you can talk to us about the Tree of Life.
Thank you. To my left, we have a work that is called the Tree of Life. It was also called Jerusalem Jug. We're not sure why, but that still remains to be discovered. We have it is a three-sided hollow cylinder. Each side is different, has different iconography on it. On the first side, you have this exquisitely unfurling tree with its branches and little upright leaves, which remind me of candles. In a way, it is a sort of a ceremonial or ritual object that is a poem to a spiritual existence. And one needs to remember that Jackson would have been an animist. He would have believed that the spirit resides in the wood, that God is found in the material and in nature. As we move around, I think if you can actually move around, you can actually see the hollow interior through these three windows, and there's an arch at the top. It's almost like a place for reliquaries, could be to be stored, but surprisingly and delightful, up this side you have a train with all its carriages moving up. There's the engine with its little smoke and billowing out, and right next to it is a snake that sort of glides upwards. We don't know, are they traveling upwards? It's moving up to some celestial realm? Are they on a journey upwards to the spiritual realm? On this side we have figures. You have half torsos standing on each other, as if when you need to help each other to get anywhere. You need to stand and help and assist other people. There's a little bird on the top, and this side has a 6th-floor facade, which reminds me of a cathedral. It will remind other people of other things, with peoples and birds and arches. And on the top, which is perhaps indicates for you really what this is about, is a lion and a lamb lying together. They symbolize the Messianic age, where the two opposites, the two warring opposites, the lion and the lamb, who generally fight with each other. In Jackson's hope that these two opposites would come together to live in a harmonious world and at peace. And that is his vision for humanity, is to live together in peace.
So we move on to the next plant-like form. If if one sees the delicacy with which Hlungwani carves this piece, it is quite remarkable. And this is a domesticated plant. You see it sitting in a number of containers, and it's a work called woodflower, and the leaves turn back on each other to small containers, almost chalice-like elements, so it feels as though water moves down like in a fountain. And that in both A Tree of Life and in this piece one sees Hlungwani's particular love and respect of the plant world, and we saw them in the circular structure of that very early piece, where one saw the carving in that cosmic circle of plants, of wild animals, the domestic animals. And it's a bit like the Starr, Michael Starr, which we spoke about earlier. I can't think of another sculptural precedent for a piece like this. And it is a piece made in the late 1970s, and becomes the growth point for a number of other sculptures, but which focus mainly on using the wood as a symbol in its own right of the life force. In our exhibitions here at Norval Foundation, we focus the exhibitions by the use of a timeline, and the timeline helps us to position both the artist's work and the context in which the work is made. And Nessa, I would very much like you to talk about the early Christianity and how that influences Jackson in the contemporary.
So on the wall here in front of me, we have the timeline that we put together for the exhibition. I think we were all rather surprised, really, when we began to put together a brief history of Christianity in terms of Jackson's life. What you discover is, in fact, Christianity moves into North Africa extremely early on. It is there by 50 CE. So 50 years after Christ is born. It becomes the official religion in Axum, which is the ancient Eritrea and Ethiopia. It is a state religion in the 4th century AD. And it is only after that, really, that it begins to move into Western Europe. So in fact, we have a great antiquity, a history of Christianity in Africa that is extraordinarily early and very and foundational, and it becomes an inspiration for many of the Zionist churches, the African and the African churches that splinter off. You will see that missionaries only begin, missionaries from the West really only begin to come to South Africa in the late 1700s and 1800s. So that is a much later Christianity. And this will give you, and it shows you the history of the ANC. We've linked Jackson's life in with the political changes in Southern Africa, the political changes in Africa, where there is a huge flood of independence, of nations gaining their independence. We have their flags to show you which ones gained independence. There were so many we couldn't actually fit everything in, but you have here, which is so South Africa is in fact the last one, and is the site of great resistance to the apartheid rule. You have the Rivonia Trialist in 1964, and in 1965 Jackson carves the God with Ball, which is incredibly close to the representation of Haile Selassie, who was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. And we also found a link into the Rastafari movement, who believed that Haile Selassie was in fact the manifestation of God on earth. And so, you know, we began to, even in the map, we began to, in the timeline, we began to see links. We see Bob Marley, the Rastafarian musician who visited Ethiopia. They believed that Ethiopia was, and Africa was Zion. It was the land for black people, for African Christianity, and he performed, in fact, at the Zimbabwean Independence Day celebration. On Jackson Hlungwani's wall, we found in a video clip 2 posters of Peter Tosh, who was a Rastafarian musician who championed the liberation of Africans from their bounded and condition. We move on. We show some of Jackson's work and also how he becomes having a profile in the art world in South Africa and some globally. He travels to Japan. We give you the timeline here. You see South Africa, Mandela being the first president in 1994, and a general sort of overview of his exhibitions, catalogues, and some world events. Thank you.
So in the exhibition, we also have a very beautiful set of drawings done by Peter Rich, which contextualize Hlungwani's altars, which are the focus of Gallery 8, the very large space. And Hlungwani's altars were made for a particular site at Mbokoto, which was an Acropolis site. And it's this site that Peter Rich did carefully map in the late 80s and was part of the very first exhibition. And recently he has drawn a elevation, and the site at Mbokoto was an Iron Age site. It was a hilltop, and Jackson chose to go to live on this hilltop site. And in the drawing we see how devotees or visitors to Hlungwani would come to this lower part of the mountain, climb up steeply through and past pylons up into this region here, 6 and 7, which was a waiting area and a healing area. They're very thick stone walls which were related to the Iron Age site. Hlungwani seemed to have spent about 60% of his time actually building these stone walls, not only carving. So we go past 7 and 8 to number 9, which is a room with very, very thick walls, quite a large space that you looked down into, and it was called Christ's Office. And then to 11 and 12, where he and his family lived, up to 15, which was his workshop, and his workshop looked out over the altar sites 18, 19, and 20, which were circular platforms or rectangular platforms on which the altars were the sculptures were placed on the altars.
So just a description that he actually preached from the altars to his community.
So so as Nessa's pointing out, he did preach from these altars to his community, and drums were used, and there were kind of circular dances that took place, you know, in small groups on the site. So it was a sacred site, and what's of particular interest is that he has this African Christianity which is laid on top of this very early Iron Age site, pre-colonial Iron Age site. So there's this kind of fluidity of values which underscores his work. So we're going to enter Gallery 9, and as we do, we're going to see the sculpture of God with ball, or God with globe, and here he is, very similar to the image that you saw of Haile Selassie. But the ball that he holds in his hand looks more like a crystal ball, and so he seems to look into the future with this ball, and this ball and its relationship to God becomes a theme which develops over a lifetime, and we're walking here towards the sculpture God with God playing football, which is a piece from the National Gallery, and God here seems to have his eyes closed. He has his hand at his stomach in a kind of reverent mode, and his feet are dribbling this ball, and so it's a very beautiful, powerful image of God playing ball, and it relates to a much earlier sculpture of Christ playing football, which we'll see on the altar further back. So we're going to move from here to look at these groups of platters and of bowls. So Hlungwani learnt from his father the carving of sticks, bowls, and of household objects, and so these are related. These are related to sacred objects in the society. The bowl, for instance, here is called Bowl for Nations, and this is where the bowls are used as a site of sharing and a site of connection in many of these communities. There are no tables in Africa or in the Pacific, so when one person eats, all people eat. And so this Bowl for Nations is a hope from Hlungwani for the world's great nations to eat together, and for this peace to return to both Africa and to the world. So we are going to move towards the altars, and you'll get a wide overview of the altars as we walk towards them. This is the altar of Christ, and this stood on the top of the hill at Mbokoto and was the site of veneration of his devotees. The iconography is complex. We see a set of figures that were placed on an oval stone platform, and they were used in a didactic mode to talk to many of the images, or many of the ideas that informed his thinking. So we see here a group of Shangaan warriors linked to his lineage, to his ancestry on the altar. You'll see the shields from the Shangaan warriors move across to Gabriel here. So this Gabriel is very different to the previous Gabriel that we have seen. He has a shield, he has his two arms on the one side and a crown. As we move across, we see Cain, and Cain also has a shield linking him as being a spiritual warrior, and Cain's aeroplane, which is this very strange object below. In the background we see Christ with the halo and with a metal standard, and behind him is the map for God and Christ. You can see, as we have set up this altar, that we've set it against a historic photograph of the site, and you are aware that the altar was amongst the trees, and we get a palpable sense of the historic past. We see the fish, which is a image of an animal which was closely associated to him and to his. It was almost like a deep association, like a totem, but apparently totems or power animals are those that are associated with families. One gets the Ndlovus, or one gets the association with elephants or with crocodiles. So the fish are particularly important for Hlungwani, and we see on the back wall large numbers of fish which are also associated to Christ, and the school of fish, that long thin panel, is a group of fish that swim with great speed in one direction. If we swing around, we will see a ribbon fish at the top of the second altar, and a bowed piece of wood which brings the whole altar together. We have a Gabriel, early Gabriel image here, a radiant crucifix, and then the very famous Christ playing football, which I'm afraid at night it seems a bit dark here, but he is the first figure that dribbles the world very carefully between his 2 feet, and then he again moves that arm in a sense of reverence to his stomach and his leg, and he feels almost like a piece from Bruges or a 16th or 15th century European sculpture. So there's a fluidity in Hlungwani's work which crosses many cultural boundaries, and here is an image of God. In many cultures God or humans are not to be shown, but Hlungwani shows God, and so God is immanent. Gabriel, God, and Christ lived with Hlungwani on the hilltop at Mbokoto, and so there is this eminent quality that relates to Christ playing football, where if we think of the early Christ nailed to the cross, Hlungwani transforms the Christ here to something joyous. Christ plays football, a game that is loved across Africa and has rules around community, and we feel that there is an embraciveness that Hlungwani shares with his community. Nessa, if you could talk to us a bit about Cain, Adam and the birth of Eve.
The birth of Eve. This extraordinarily large sculpture, I think it's 3 or 4 meters high, 4 and a bit meters. Again, one wonders, well, what on earth is going on? What is encapsulated in this work is the joining together of opposites, opposites that are at war with each other or fighting or disagreeing. You have Adam and Eve within that, the conflict between Adam and Eve, but also the birth of their sons, Cain and Abel. Their feet are they are being born out of this tree. The tree is like a tree of life, but it's also the family tree, the genealogical tree. And it seems as if what Hlungwani has done is put the warring factions, these opposites, together in one form. And the form is the material is a tree. It is wood. It is this divine substance that Hlungwani held to be sacred, and you see all these awkward angles and these arms coming out and these feet coming out, and it's as if they're struggling within this form to come to terms with each other, to reconcile, to make peace with each other. What is really interesting is you have the hand, beautiful hand coming out from the side, cupping the egg. Once again, we see the motif of the egg coming forward, held very gently in the hand. What we have at the top, there is fingers holding an orb, and it seems as if that's plucking. It's as if it's a plucking of a fruit that may be the fruit of the tree of knowledge, the site of Adam and Eve being exiled from the Garden of Eden. You have a little head coming out at the top, which may well be Eve, but I think you see the sense of struggle and Jackson's perhaps wishful imagination that in fact they would reconcile, as he hoped that South Africa would reconcile and live together in peace and harmony.
Thank you, Nessa. We sweep past a number of fish along this large wall at the Norval, which took quite some doing in getting these extremely heavy objects in place. I'm walking towards a mysterious image of God, one of the final works that we'll be looking at this evening, and you will see that he is enormous. He is awesome. He is quite difficult to read. At the top you will just see an eye sticking out, a nose, square lips, a double beard, and then there are two biceps and hands with the hands held together as they move forward into the future here. So he is he's dark, he's quite mysterious, he is an authoritarian God. I think he is from the he's from the Old Testament, and when we come to this side, you will see that he is very difficult to get a gestalt of. He hardly looks human, and I keep saying that that Hlungwani finds God in a tree, and that in many ways he is an animist, and that in that animism he has this close contact to stones, plants, and that his sculptures grow out of the trees themselves. His church has no roof, no steeple, and that his ideas morph constantly. So rather than only seeing this dark, rather ominous God, we find this beautiful sculpture called God Playing Football, a late work where God here has his hands in just above his chest. He has a tie, and his feet seem to move towards each other in a kind of diffident mode. And the eggs that we saw in the previous in the previous leg, have now become balls that he is obviously kicking, and that previously in the very early sculpture we saw that foot with eggs, but here now we see the full God himself. And finally, we walk into the gallery where we have a group of thrones, which are made of very fluid pieces of wood, almost shards, and that these are not usable objects. These are symbolic chairs. These are thrones for the presence of God. This is a piece from the National Gallery, and this almost flame-like back to the throne has two hands of God on it, and it's certainly not a chair one would watch television on. And when we move here to the left, we see this very abstract throne, which looks more like a pelvis, a pelvic bone, that seems to allude to a transitional moment, a moment of birth or rebirth. And Hlungwani's thrones are not made of bronze or studded with jewels. They are made with the reverent materials for him of wood itself. So in this exhibition we have this remarkable opportunity to see Hlungwani's work together, to be able to make the links, and to be able to in many ways understand the complexity of his work as a sculptor in Africa, rooted in Africa, understanding the inclusiveness of the continent, and in many ways of a consciousness that is shared by humanity. And the Norval Foundation has made an exhibition like this possible, and Hlungwani's work is seen for the first time here by Cape Townians who have seen the odd piece at the National Gallery. And it is a real gift for us as South Africans to be able to have this chance to engage the work and to reconsider his place within the nation and the continent. The exhibition is dedicated to Okwewenzo, the great African curator who was determined that this exhibition would take place. Owenzo died, I think, 2 years ago, and so this exhibition honors both Jackson Hlungwani and Okwewenzo. Nessa, thank you very much for this evening, for being here, and for taking us through, and we look forward to inviting you to the next novel, Walkabout. Good night.